The location was a farmhouse near the tiny community of Kelly, Kentucky, about 7 miles north of Hopkinsville in Christian County. This was rural America in 1955. Farmland, sparse housing, limited electricity, the kind of isolated setting where neighbors were far apart and self-reliance was essential. The nearest town, Hopkinsville, had a population of around 12,000. Kelly itself was barely a crossroads. The farmhouse belonged to the Sutton family, but on the evening of August 21st, 1955, it was crowded with visitors. The group included Billy Ray Taylor and his wife June, Elmer Lucky Sutton and his wife Vera, their children who were staying elsewhere that evening, J.C. Sutton, O.P. Baker, Glennie Langford, and several other adult family members and friends. All were working class adults, farmers and labourers, people accustomed to hard work and practical thinking. The witness who would drive the initial events was Billy Ray Taylor, a man in his early 20s visiting from Pennsylvania. Taylor's credibility would later be questioned by some investigators, but his account was corroborated in essential details by every other witness present. Whatever happened that night, it wasn't the fabrication of a single individual. Taylor had no history of attention-seeking behavior, no apparent motive for creating an elaborate hoax. He was a visitor, unfamiliar with the area, simply spending an evening with relatives. What drove him to report what he saw wasn't a desire for publicity. It was fear, pure and instinctive, the kind that overrides embarrassment or rational consideration. The evening began ordinarily. The group gathered at the farmhouse, talking, relaxing after dinner. The weather was warm, typical for late August in Kentucky. No storms, no unusual atmospheric conditions, just a quiet summer evening in the countryside. Around 7 p.m., Billy Ray Taylor went outside to draw water from the well. The sun had set, but twilight still provided visibility. As he worked the pump, he noticed something in the sky to the west. A luminous object, brightly colored, descended from the clouds. It wasn't falling, it moved with control, slowing as it approached the ground. Taylor watched as it dropped below the tree line, disappearing behind vegetation, perhaps a quarter mile from the farmhouse. He didn't hear any sound of impact, no crash, no explosion. It simply descended out of sight. Taylor went back inside and told the others what he'd seen. The reaction was predictable. Skepticism mixed with humor. They'd seen shooting stars, they said, or maybe a meteor. Taylor insisted it had been different, controlled, deliberate. But without any way to investigate in the growing darkness, the group dismissed it and returned to their evening. About an hour later, the dogs outside began barking frantically. Not the casual, alert bark of animals hearing distant sounds, but sustained, aggressive barking mixed with sounds of distress. Then suddenly the dogs went silent. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor grabbed firearms, a .22 rifle and a 20-gauge shotgun, standard farm equipment for dealing with predators or pests, and went to investigate. The farmhouse had no air conditioning, so doors and windows were open to catch any breeze. The two men stepped onto the back porch. What they saw would shatter any assumption about an ordinary evening. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, approximately 50 feet from the house. It wasn't a person. It wasn't any animal either man recognized. In the dim light from the house and the rising moon, they could see it clearly. The entity was small, perhaps 3 to 3.5 feet tall. Its body appeared thin, almost emaciated, with limbs that seemed disproportionately long. The head was large relative to the body, with enormous eyes that reflected the light with a yellowish glow. The skin, if it was skin, appeared metallic, silvery, catching and reflecting light in a way that seemed unnatural. Most unsettling were the arms. They extended down past where knees would be on a human, ending in large hands with what appeared to be talons or claws. The entity moved toward the house with a peculiar gait, not quite walking, more like gliding with minimal up and down motion. Lucky Sutton raised his shotgun and fired. The distance was close, the target clear. At that range, buckshot should have devastated any living creature. Instead, the entity reacted as if struck by something minor. It flipped backward, tumbled, and scrambled into the darkness. But there was no wound visible, no sign of injury, no evidence the shot had done anything beyond knock it over. Both men were experienced hunters. They knew what happened when shot struck flesh. This wasn't that. This was like shooting at metal, impact without penetration. They retreated into the house and barricaded the doors. Taylor's account of the flying object suddenly seemed less dismissible. Something was out there. Something that bullets couldn't stop. For the next several minutes, nothing happened. The group inside the farmhouse discussed what to do. Some wanted to leave immediately, but others pointed out the vulnerability of being outside if more of those things were present. They decided to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and wait for daylight. Then the entities appeared again. Multiple figures this time. Witnesses looking through windows reported seeing the creatures approaching the house from different directions. They moved in a coordinated way that suggested communication or shared purpose. Some approached the front of the house, others the sides. They peered into windows, their enormous eyes reflecting interior light with an eerie luminescence. One creature climbed onto the roof. Witnesses inside could hear it moving above them, footsteps that seemed too light for the size they had observed, as if the entity weighed far less than its volume suggested. It positioned itself near the roof's edge and looked down through a window, its face pressed close to the glass. Lucky Sutton fired at it through the window screen. The shot struck the creature directly. It tumbled from the roof, but again, there was no evidence of injury. It scrambled away into the darkness, moving with the same fluid, almost mechanical precision. The siege had begun in earnest. For the next 3 to 4 hours, the entities appeared repeatedly, approaching the house from various directions, peering into windows, attempting to enter through doors. Every time the men fired at them, and they fired repeatedly, expending considerable ammunition, the creatures would be knocked back or over, then retreat, only to return minutes later apparently unharmed. The witnesses inside described the entity's movement as unlike anything in their experience. When shot, they wouldn't fall naturally. They'd flip backward as if pushed by the impact's force, then scramble away with unsettling speed and agility. They could climb walls and trees with ease, defying normal biomechanics. When they raised their arms above their heads, a gesture they performed repeatedly, they seemed to float or hover briefly before descending. The adult witnesses inside the farmhouse were terrified. These weren't abstract lights in the sky or ambiguous distant objects. These were physical entities close enough to touch the windows, apparently impervious to gunfire, displaying intelligence in their coordinated approaches and tactical positioning. Vera Sutton, Lucky's wife, later described the absolute terror of seeing these creatures peer into the windows, their enormous eyes reflecting lamplight, their thin arms raised as if reaching for something. The psychological impact of being surrounded, unable to effectively defend yourself despite being armed, trapped in your own home. It left marks that lasted decades. The entities never attempted to break through windows or force doors despite having multiple opportunities. They appeared curious, observant, but not overtly aggressive beyond their intimidating presence. Yet their persistence and apparent invulnerability created a horror beyond simple physical threat. Around 11 p.m., during a lull in the creature's appearances, the group made a decision. They would make a run for their vehicles and drive to the Hopkinsville police station. It was a risk, exposing themselves during the dash to the cars, but staying seemed equally dangerous and ammunition was running low. They emerged together, adults rushing for the two vehicles parked near the house. No entities were visible during those crucial seconds. Engines started, tires spun on gravel, and both vehicles raced down the farm road toward Hopkinsville, leaving the farmhouse behind. They arrived at the Hopkinsville police station around 11:20 p.m. All 11 adults piled out of the vehicles and rushed inside, talking over each other, describing entities and siege and bullets that didn't work. The desk officer initially thought they were drunk or playing a prank, but their obvious terror and the consistency of their accounts quickly changed his assessment. These weren't people seeking attention. These were genuinely frightened individuals, some trembling, all speaking with the urgency of people who'd experienced something traumatic. The officer called for backup and notified the chief of police, Russell Greenwell, and the Christian County Sheriff's Office. Within 30 minutes, a response team assembled. Local police, county sheriff's deputies, state police officers, and military police from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base. Around 20 officers, heavily armed and equipped with searchlights, drove in convoy to the Sutton farmhouse. What they found was puzzling. The farmhouse showed clear signs of the reported gunfight: bullet holes in screens and walls, expended shell casings scattered around the property, furniture overturned where people had taken cover. But there were no bodies, no blood, no physical evidence of the entities themselves. Officers conducted an extensive search of the property and surrounding area, using searchlights to penetrate the darkness. They found no unusual tracks, no landing site consistent with Taylor's initial observation of the descending object, no physical evidence of the entities described by witnesses. However, they did note several unusual details. The bullet holes were real, the damage consistent with close-range shooting from inside the house. The witnesses' obvious distress seemed genuine. These weren't people who appeared to be fabricating a story. And there was an unusual luminescence observed in some areas around the property, a faint glow that officers couldn't immediately explain, though it could have been phosphorescent fungi or other natural phenomena. The investigators remained on site for several hours. No entities appeared during their presence. Eventually, convinced there was no immediate threat and finding no evidence to substantiate the witnesses' claims, they departed, leaving the family with instructions to contact them if anything further occurred. The witnesses, still frightened but reassured by the official response and the thorough search finding nothing, eventually returned to the farmhouse. Around 3:30 a.m., after the police had departed, Glennie Langford reported seeing one of the entities again, briefly visible at a window before disappearing. But by then, exhaustion had set in, and no one had the energy to respond beyond ensuring doors remained secured. By dawn, the entities were gone. They never returned to the Sutton farmhouse, and none of the witnesses reported any subsequent encounters. The story, however, was just beginning. News of the incident spread rapidly. By the next day, reporters from regional newspapers had descended on Kelly and Hopkinsville. The Sutton family, initially reluctant to discuss the experience, found themselves thrust into unwanted spotlight. The farmhouse became a tourist attraction, with curious seekers driving out to see the location and hopefully witness something themselves. The witnesses were interviewed repeatedly by journalists, law enforcement, and later by official UFO investigators. Their accounts remained remarkably consistent across these interviews, even when witnesses were questioned separately. The basic narrative never changed. Taylor saw a descending object. Entities appeared approximately an hour later. They besieged the farmhouse for hours. Bullets seemed ineffective. The family fled to police. Officers found no physical evidence of entities. Air Force investigators from Project Blue Book, the official US government program for investigating UFO reports, visited the site and interviewed witnesses. Their official conclusion, filed in their reports, suggested the witnesses had misidentified great horned owls. The metallic appearance they proposed could have been moonlight reflecting off the birds' feathers. The large eyes were consistent with owl morphology. The apparent floating or hovering could be explained by owl flight characteristics. This explanation satisfied exactly no one who'd examined the case carefully. Great horned owls, while impressive birds, stand roughly 2 feet tall and have wingspans of about 4 feet. They make distinctive sounds when disturbed or threatened. They would have been immediately recognizable to the rural witnesses, who were familiar with local wildlife. And most critically, shotgun blasts at close range would have been catastrophically effective against birds. The owl explanation seemed designed more to close the case than to explain it accurately. It entered the official record, was cited in subsequent Air Force summaries, and became the go-to skeptical explanation despite its obvious inadequacies. Those who believed the Hopkinsville witnesses experienced a genuine encounter with unknown entities point to several compelling elements. First, the multiple, independent witnesses. 11 adults, all describing the same basic entities and sequence of events. Mass hallucination involving 11 people over 4 hours strains credibility. Second, the physical evidence of sustained gunfire. The witnesses expended significant ammunition at a relatively close range, creating bullet holes throughout the property. This wasn't a fleeting sighting, but a sustained event where individuals had time to aim, fire, observe results, and fire again. Third, the witnesses' lack of financial gain. The Sutton family never profited from their experience. They didn't sell their story, didn't seek publicity, and eventually left the property to escape unwanted attention. People don't typically maintain elaborate fabrications for years when there's no benefit. Fourth, the professional response and investigation. Police, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and military police all took the report seriously enough to conduct extensive searches. While they found no entities, they also found no evidence suggesting hoax or deception. Fifth, the psychological impact on witnesses. Interviews conducted decades after the incident showed that witnesses remained affected by their experience, still reluctant to discuss it in detail, still exhibiting signs of having experienced genuine trauma. Skeptics offer alternative explanations that attempt to account for the incident without invoking extraterrestrial or paranormal elements. Beyond the owl explanation, other theories have emerged. One suggestion is that the witnesses encountered escaped circus monkeys or exotic animals. Christian County Fair was held in August, and traveling shows sometimes brought unusual animals. However, no reports of escaped animals were filed, and monkeys don't match the specific descriptions of metallic skin and enormous eyes. Additionally, bullets would have been highly effective against monkeys at close range. Another explanation centers on mass hysteria, triggered by an initial misidentification. Perhaps Taylor saw a meteor or unusual cloud formation and interpreted it as a craft. Later, when something mundane occurred, an owl, a neighborhood cat, even a person playing a prank. The primed expectation caused misidentification that spread through the group. Fear and darkness amplified the experience. Gunfire created chaos, and the group's collective belief reinforced the extraordinary interpretation. This explanation accounts for the lack of physical evidence and the consistency of reports. If everyone believed they were seeing aliens, they'd interpret ambiguous stimuli in ways that matched that belief. The sustained duration could be explained by repeated misidentifications of mundane animals or objects, each interpreted through the lens of the initial UFO report. Some skeptics have suggested outright hoax, though this seems least likely. Creating bullet holes throughout your property, terrifying your family, calling police and military to investigate, enduring decades of unwanted attention and ridicule, all for no apparent financial gain or other benefit, seems an extraordinary price for a practical joke. The alcohol explanation that witnesses were intoxicated and experiencing shared delusion is contradicted by police reports. Officers who interviewed the witnesses immediately after the incident noted no signs of intoxication. All witnesses were coherent, consistent, and appeared genuinely frightened rather than confused or inebriated. What remains genuinely puzzling is the official response. 20 armed officers conducted a thorough search and found nothing. If the entities were physical beings, where did they go? If they were vehicles or craft, where was the landing site? If they were real, why did they disappear so completely when authorities arrived? The lack of physical evidence is the strongest argument against the encounter being what witnesses claimed. No bodies, no residual traces, no equipment or artifacts, no disturbance patterns in surrounding vegetation, nothing to corroborate the presence of unknown entities beyond the testimony of frightened people and evidence of extensive gunfire. Yet the bullet holes and shell casings proved something happened that night. People don't fire dozens of rounds into their own property at nothing. Whether they were shooting at misidentified wildlife, experiencing shared delusion, or genuinely defending against unknown entities, they believed they were under threat. The case has been investigated and reinvestigated by researchers for nearly 70 years. Some focus on trying to identify the specific stimulus that triggered the event. What could have created the appearance of small, metallic beings? Others examine the psychological and sociological aspects. How does a group of people come to share an extraordinary experience? A few researchers have noted connections to folklore. The description of the entities bears resemblance to traditional descriptions of goblins, sprites, or fairy folk from European folklore. Small stature, otherworldly appearance, apparent invulnerability, mischievous behavior. Could the witnesses have tapped into archetypal imagery, interpreting an ambiguous experience through cultural narratives embedded in collective consciousness? The modern UFO interpretation came primarily from investigators rather than witnesses. The Suttons and their visitors never claimed they were attacked by aliens. They described strange creatures, things they couldn't identify. It was later researchers who framed this as an extraterrestrial encounter, connecting Taylor's initial sighting of the descending object to the creature's appearance an hour later. What we're left with is a case that resists comfortable resolution. Was the Hopkinsville Encounter a genuine interaction between humans and unknown entities? Whether extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, or something else entirely beyond current understanding? Were 11 adults victims of a remarkable case of shared misperception, where fear and darkness transformed ordinary stimuli into extraordinary experiences? Was there a mundane explanation, exotic animals, elaborate prank, natural phenomena that has eluded 70 years of investigation. Those who believe in the paranormal or extraterrestrial see Hopkinsville as one of the most compelling close encounter cases. Multiple credible witnesses, sustained duration, defensive action taken, official investigation conducted. These elements create a case that's difficult to dismiss as simple misidentification. Skeptics see a fascinating example of how extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and how human perception under stress can create coherent narratives from ambiguous experiences. The lack of physical evidence, they argue, is fatal to claims of genuine encounter with physical beings. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Hopkinsville case isn't what happened, but what it reveals about human experience and belief. 11 adults shared something that night. Whether objective reality or subjective perception, it was real to them. They experienced terror, fired weapons in defense, fled their home, sought police protection, and carried psychological scars for decades. Whether that makes the entities real or simply makes the fear real is a question each person must answer based on their own understanding of consciousness, perception, and the boundaries of possible experience. The Sutton farmhouse stood for years after the incident, eventually falling into disrepair and finally being demolished. The site is now marked only by overgrown foundation stones and a few scattered outbuildings. Kelly remains a tiny community, its population barely larger than in 1955, but every August, researchers and enthusiasts make pilgrimages to the area, commemorating the night when something, whether extraterrestrial visitors, misidentified wildlife, or manifestation of collective fear, laid siege to a farmhouse in rural Kentucky. The town has embraced its place in UFO history, hosting an annual festival that draws visitors from around the world. The witnesses who survived into the modern era rarely gave interviews and never profited from their experience. They maintained their accounts but showed no interest in celebrity or validation. For them, the Hopkinsville encounter was simply something that happened, something they couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Whether that makes them witnesses to one of history's most significant close encounters or victims of one of psychology's most interesting cases of shared misperception remains an open question. What's certain is that something happened in Kelly, Kentucky on August 21st, 1955, something that sent 11 adults fleeing in terror, something that inspired one of the most thorough investigations in early UFO history, something that continues to provoke debate and research 70 years later. The silence from those entities, wherever they came from, whatever they were, may be the most telling clue of all. They appeared, they besieged, they vanished, leaving only terrified witnesses and unanswered questions in their wake. Whether they were visitors from distant worlds testing human responses, manifestations of phenomena science hasn't yet explained, or simply the product of fear and darkness transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, is a mystery that continues to haunt the fields of Kentucky where it all began.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.